February is over and we've cracked down every week. Yeah. It was one hell of a month. Talks of nuclear proliferation and mutually assured destruction are back.
Yay!
And a bunch of Trump campaign documents got released. Measles is back, a national emergency was declared, and the president was overtly accused of campaign finance crimes, in addition to a bunch of other sketchy stuff. It's times like these we wonder, does this garbage ever really get better? I don't know. Let's find out. By focusing our raw news energy, we're going way back in time to February 1919. The Union faced one of its most monumental strikes, and a world leader is nearly assassinated in Europe, all while Germany and the rest of the world struggles to recover from the First World War. Also, some national parks you may have heard of. From WHIP, I'm Maya Tejada, and this is your WHIP Vintage News Crackdown. This was a rough time for workers in the United States, and violent clashes between workers and frequently corrupt authorities in the late 1800s were still in living memory. On February 6, 1919, the Seattle General Strike began. The strike featured 60,000 workers representing all 110 unions of the Seattle Central Labor Council. They walked out in solidarity with shipyard workers, demanding employers and the government to honor their promises of higher wages made during World War I. As February began, talks of striking were already underway. 30,000 shipyard workers had been on strike for over a week, and Seattle newspapers were full of information about who would join them. The General Strike Committee of the Metal Trades Council and other organizations asked the general public, essentially, where does the interest of the average businessman lie? In the hands of shipyard owners or in the fate of the worker in this strike? On that Thursday, February 6th, the wheels of Seattle stopped turning, and a 300,000-strong city ground to a halt. Those on strike were advised to stay in their homes, avoid large congregations, and above all to obey the orders of the General Strike Committee. One disorderly action and they could not win. Such a large strike would be difficult to maintain, and by Monday, February 10th, the strike was over. On Tuesday, the city went back to work. Although many historians consider the strike to be a failure due to how quickly it fizzled out, its influence is still evident in Seattle today. The strike is a major feature of Seattle's local history, and current union membership in Seattle is almost at a double of the national average.
Another one!
But Spain got in on the strike action too. The Barcelona General Strike is remembered as one of the most successful working class actions in history. The strike began when 8 workers from the maintenance department of a Canadian finance hydroelectric plant were laid off for political reasons. The strike was led by the anarcho-syndicalistic union, the Confederación Nacional de Trabajo, or CNT, and involved more than 100,000 workers at that point. About 10% of the active Spanish adult population were members of the CNT. After those first few workers were laid off, about 140 people walked out of work on February 5th. By February 21st, a citywide general strike of power workers was called, and the Captain General declared martial law in the city. The Madrid authorities then declared a state of emergency, and in an attempt to break the strike, gave strikers the option of either joining the army or going back to work. Newspapers owned by the CNT refused to print anything that reflected negatively on the strike, including information about the draft. Under the state of martial law in the city, almost all CNT officials were arrested alongside 3,000 strikers. On the 15th and 16th of March, negotiations began between the union and the authorities. Ultimately, the authorities conceded to all demands, and the first 8-hour work days were established. Germany was in rough shape right around now. Following the end of World War I, German officials held their first National Assembly meeting on February 6 to establish a new government. This government will be called the Weimar Republic. After Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne in November 1918, elections were held for a National Assembly that would be tasked with creating a new parliamentary constitution under the leadership of President Friedrich Ebert. At the time, Germany was still reeling from the strain of fighting a world war. 17 sessions were held throughout the month as the assembly worked to create a constitution for their new democratic government. The constitution they completed was not ratified until August 11th. Despite having a brief period of success, the government would prove to be ineffective. The Weimar Republic was plagued by hyperinflation, increasing overall public distrust of the government leaders. This would set the stage for Nazis to rise to power later in the century. Meanwhile, African politics were getting organized in the aftermath of World War I. From February 19th until the 22nd, the first Pan-African Congress took place. It was held alongside the Paris Peace Conference and attempted to secure a place for people of African descent within the New World Order. W.E.B. Du Bois, who arranged the Congress, traveled to France in December of 1918 as a representative of the NAACP, confident that the Paris Peace Conference provided the ideal setting for a parallel gathering of black dignitaries from around the world to discuss the international problem of racism. But racism, it turns out, is pretty sticky. Few African representatives could attend because colonial governments refused to allow them passage to Paris. Du Bois, along with a French parliamentarian and Senegalese native Blaise Diagne, met with 55 other participants from 15 nations in Paris over 3 days in February. They petitioned the peace conference with two demands. The first was that the Allies give their former German territories in Africa autonomy. The second was for Africans to be allowed to take part in governing their own countries. On February 19th, during that Paris peace conference, an assassination attempt was made on the Prime Minister of France as he left his apartment. Georges Clemenceau was Prime Minister of France from 1906 to 1909 and again from 1917 to 1920. While he was on his way to meet with Colonel Edward M. House from the American Peace Delegation and British Forest Secretary, that's a lot of people. While he was on his way to meet with a Colonel Edward M. House from the American Peace Delegation and British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, 7 shots were fired at Mr. Clemenceau. He was hit 3 times. 1 bullet penetrated between his ribs and 1 was never removed. He was sentenced to death on March 14th after declaring that if he had been able to escape from the crowd that seized him, he would have made another attempt at the Prime Minister's life. Hey, what do you know? Taxes were in the news too 100 years ago. On February 25th, Oregon passed the nation's first per-gallon gas tax. The first gasoline tax was only 1 cent to the gallon. That's 12.6 cents today. Before the tax, gasoline sold about 25 cents a gallon, or a little over $3 today. In 1917, Oregon State Highway Commission started a Get Oregon Out of the Mud campaign for better roads. Then this campaign paved the way for the introduction of the tax. Within 6 weeks of Oregon's monumental move, Colorado and New Mexico adopted a similar tax. North Dakota established one later that year. By the end of the following decade, all other states had a gasoline tax of 1, 2, or 3 cents on the gallon. Interestingly, Oregon is still at it. From 2006 to 2007, the state ran a 300-car pilot program to test the idea of equipping all vehicles with GPS and then taxing them by miles driven. Neat. Finally, on February 26, Congress passed an act to establish the Grand Canyon National Park in the state of Arizona. Before the middle of the 19th century, very little was known about the geography of the Grand Canyon because of its remote location. Only one early visitor, Warren Augustus Ferris, is known to have produced a map showing the Grand Canyon. Drawn in 1836, it was not published until 1940, too late to be of use to the geographers and explorers who first traveled to the Colorado River and the canyon during the late 19th century. The Grand Canyon comprises over 1 million acres of northwestern Arizona, and the park includes the most spectacular area of the 277-mile canyon cut by the Colorado River. That same day, Congress approved an act to establish the Lafayette National Park. At Mount Desert Island off the coast of Maine, it was later renamed the Acadia National Park in 1929. This was the first national park located east of the Mississippi and was the site of the first French mission to America in 1613. In the mid-1800s, the island experienced an influx of wealthy summer tourists. Some of those visitors built lavish homes there at the end of the century. George Dorr was one of those residents and led the effort to preserve the landscape. Dorr became the first superintendent when the area was finally designated a national park in 1919.
So that's what was up 100 years ago. The world was trying to glue itself together after World War I. Workers were fighting for better treatment, and the U.S. was slowly bothering to preserve the land it was situated on. How about that? That's all the time we have for today. I hope you enjoyed this peek into the past. Join us next week for the current news that you care about. From WHIP, I'm Maya Tejada, and this has been your WHIP News Crackdown. Is it News Crackdown or Weekly?
Subscribe!
I don't know what's happening.
Share! Tell your friends!